Okay, I couldn't resist, sorry. It's really for Colin, I suppose. I come
Sorry,
from
can you say who you are and where you're from?
Apologies, Gita Puri, Environmental Protection Scotland. Having worked in air quality in old money times, I know, Colin, that it was quite a hard task to come up with modelling and monitoring, but I suppose one thing that I am slightly wary of is, you know, people have been monitoring air quality, DEFRA, the devolved administrations, for many years. I don't see much mention of, you know, what is already out there, what models they use, the monitoring frameworks, etc. And I think, you know, while it's commendable to come up with something new, the reality in terms of resources about who is going to monitor, you know, where does the data, the outputs from the models fit into Scottish, UK, European monitoring requirements and reporting is probably something, just from my perspective anyway, that needs to maybe put into context.
I think there's a huge big difference between what's reported to Europe through the modelling process and actually what's required when you're looking at city centre models. So what we've really done is we've focused on what's really required in terms of getting the right data out of city centre models rather than the reporting process. With regards to the modelling, the monitoring framework, we haven't changed anything with regards to what we're monitoring. It's just the utilisation of the data that's different. I think we've really brought forward the use of the data and what comes out of it and how it relates to both modelled outputs and also modelled inputs. When it comes to data for the model, the transport data collection process that we've put in place really focuses quite clearly on what's required for any model. There's no point in just putting in national statistics because that doesn't reflect always what's happening on the ground and what happens at a local source. So we've really focused on that local issues.
John Webster from Transform Scotland. An awful lot seems to rely on the modelling process, and it looks like it's an awful way of pushing things many years ahead. And I do wonder, you know, in light of what you mentioned there about the uncertainties of the emissions from vehicles, that presumably is part of the modelling thing. But what I do wonder, and it seems to be missing from any solutions, I mean, we know that the air quality problems are due to congestion, basically, traffic, huge volumes of traffic, and yet a lot of our budgetary government level is all on building more roads. And yet we don't seem to look at demand management, which they've done in Europe. I think that's probably how they've achieved a lot of improvements, by shutting off city centres and investing in public transport. And I just wonder, this is maybe, we know the answer to a lot of these things already.
Yeah, I think you've got a point there about the greenest mile is a mile not travelled. So reducing the amount of journeys that we have on the road, I think, is in a number of strategies. So, for example, regional transport partnerships already have that in a commitment within their objectives, and I think it's already in there in various Scottish Government or Transport Scotland strategies to reduce those journeys. In terms of demand management, I think I'd have to check what the current position on that is, but there's certainly a suite of actions that are already outlined in the National Transport Strategy, which has currently been refreshed at this point in time. So I think the idea of congestion and getting vehicles moving and flowing a bit better is certainly one element that I think it was option 3 in the National Low Emission Framework we'll look at in terms of intelligent transport systems. I'm not an ITS expert at all, but I know people who are. And I think one of the queries I've had about intelligent transport systems particularly is, are they actually working? We say we've got them, but as a former environmental auditor, I would really like to know, do they actually work? Are they working to their optimum? So, and I wonder if the ITS professionals in the room are actually the right people to ask, because I think they're going to say, of course they are. So I wonder if, as part of the process and development of the frameworks that we've got there, is to actually do a quick test on whether the ITS systems that we have are working at the most optimum level to reduce that congestion.
Christopher Snelling from the Freight Transport Association. In some of the slides about the framework, you included the option of weight-based restrictions for access to areas. I was wondering why, given that we know from the almost 2 years they've been on the road that Euro 6 for HGVs and buses is actually working very well, and that per tonne or person moved, the HGV and the bus is by far and away the most efficient way to get goods or people around. It also seems to contradict the need for consistency. We assumed we would be talking about an emissions limit rather than use of something crude like a weight-based restriction.
Yeah, no, it's a fair point. The review or the reading that we had done in the preparation of the National Low Emission Framework in the detail, I think that you could have, I think we can just go back, that you can see in the tables. So in that table there, the review that we were looking at in terms of going from the LEZ into the access control regulations, when we looked at access control, they covered an absolute massive suite of different topics, of which just one was on weight-based. Personally, I think that will be the one that will get driven forward. I don't think so. I think there's, as you say, there's far stronger categories in which we can manage the movement of vehicles, particularly in urban areas. But if we hadn't included the weight option in there, at least it's one that could be debated, if not kicked to the side. So again, that's what I guess the call, particularly over the next 2 or 3 weeks as we're developing these work packages and briefs, is to hear from the likes of FTA to say, actually, is there a need to look at that, or should we focus attention perhaps on the first 2 or 3? And that's what we're looking for. If there's things on that slide that say annoy you or you question, come and let us know. So weight we had to include because it was part of the access control regulations reading that we had looked at, but it may be that it's superseded by probably tighter or better forms of regulation. So, gentlemen.
Stuart Hayes, Living Street, Scotland. It's quite an impressive technical process you've went to get to this point. The one point I would make, though, I think if we're going to be effective in Scotland, we do have to get to a point when we're talking about actual places and actual audiences and people. And the sooner we get to that point, the sooner we can start having impacts on the ground.
I don't know if I necessarily had a question there. Is that a statement or is there a question?
It's more, yeah, pausing for thought. At what point do we actually start doing some stuff on the ground with actual communities?
Yeah.
This is operating on quite a national, technical, top level.
Yeah. I'll maybe say one point on that, but it's perhaps not necessarily answering your question directly. The thought that we've got in our heads just now is to do 2 things in parallel. The first is develop this National Low Emission Framework and all the packages and work that go with that. But the second part is particularly looking at, the slide before, this pre-appraisal stage. It's to develop the work that needs to be put in place so that by April 2016 we actually have that pre-appraisal process up and running or ready to start. And I think that's where the localism agenda has to be involved. Who those local stakeholders are, I think is still to be decided, but it is a fair point to actually get on the ground.
I think just to add to that, you'll see within the strategy though that we do have a very good comms approach where it's taken right across the whole development of the strategy and implementation.
So we've got 5 more minutes. If I can take, there's a lady out up at the top. Right.
Amelia Hanna from Friends of the Earth Scotland. There's clearly a lot of consultation and a lot of work that has gone into developing the National Low Emissions Framework. But we are concerned about the pace of progress, given that there are 3 existing feasibility studies that have looked into low emission zones in Scotland, and given that there are many, many low emission zones across Europe already in existence, which are proving to be effective, and given that we need to meet these European legal limits as soon as possible, what is the earliest that we're actually going to see low emission zones on the ground in Scotland?
That's a good question. For what it's worth, my take on it is it'll be round about 2018. I don't think I would bet before that. And if I had to say one thing that would underpin that is the work that's needed probably across the spectrum of issues of firstly getting the guidelines in place at national standards. I particularly agree in the enforcement procedure. And that was certainly a comment that we've heard from London of agreeing, is it an all singing, all dancing ANPR camera setup versus the opposite end of the spectrum, you know, the cheap and cheerful German approach. That is still to be agreed. Then getting in place the communication to various organisations, particularly freight, haulier, bus operators, so that they have time to adapt their fleet to meet those standards. So that's my take on it at this point in time.
So can you make a commitment that we might see low emission zones on the ground by 2018, given that on the other slide, this slide, there's talk about implementation plans in 2019. Sorry, I think it was the other slide.
Going forward a bit.
That one.
Oh,
no,
sorry.
Next one. That one.
Oh, yeah.
So on that slide, there seems to be a time frame for an implementation plan by 2019. Does that mean that a low emission zone on the ground would have to come after that, or are you confident that there will be low emission zones on the ground by 2018?
That's a $64,000 question. I would like to think that's what we're aiming towards. Would I bet my mortgage on it if it was my own money? I would like to go towards that target, but like I've just said, there's a whole host of legal and political decisions and technical decisions that we have to absolutely get right before we implement something on the ground that could actually be counterproductive to where we have to go. But I think if I've learned nothing in terms of writing the CAFS document, it's nothing like having a target to aim for that incentivises people to move in that direction. But yeah, we've got a very fast-paced journey, and 2018 sounds quite a distance in time. That time will get eaten up in no time at all. So we've got 2 minutes left. I think there was one other question. Just gentleman in the middle. So if we can make it quick, we'll have gentleman at the back and then one final one at the front.
Morning, Robbie Beattie, City of Edinburgh Council. I lead the team on air quality in the city. My query was about your measures of success. You're talking about reductions in air quality management areas. There's 5 air quality management areas in Edinburgh. I could recommend we reduce that to a citywide AQMA and have a measure of success. But that would mean you've got 100% of the population in an AQMA rather than 2%. So how are you realistically going to measure success? Would it not be better to measure the number of people that are impacted by poor air quality? If I could give a follow-up, just it was mentioned about AQMAs and low emission zones. It's become quite politicised in that sort of declaration. So if you could have a street that's, say, 50 micrograms going down to 48, down to 46, down to 44, and then you declare an AQMA and suddenly that's a failure. You know, that's rather than getting help from the pressure group saying, right, let's push it down to 43 and get it down to 39. So help would be great rather than getting a kick in for, saying there's a failure.
Andrew, is there something you want to?
Yeah, you're quite correct, Robbie, to say that there's a huge range of EQMAs across Scotland, varying from one street to entire local authority areas. So in that respect, yeah, it's totally valid to point out that that's not necessarily, the reduction in the number of EQMAs is not necessarily a clear measure of success, which is why the statement that we've put in Cleaner Air for Scotland is that we want to make substantial progress towards eliminating all AQMAs by 2020. We've spent a lot of time thinking about how we could turn that into an effective measurable target, because the AQMA declaration process has so many variables associated with it, we've decided that that's just not going to come up with something meaningful. So the ultimate target is to eliminate all AQMAs, obviously, because that means we're complying with all objectives everywhere. But to have milestones along the way is not necessarily going to tell us anything. But what we do have in CAFS, which hasn't been covered in any of the presentations so far, is a series of key performance indicators. which you'll see when you see the document later on. At the moment, they're quite high level, and they need some further work as to how we develop those in more detail. But that's intended to be the main measure of how we're working towards progress with achieving our high-level aims, rather than the specific number of AQMAs reducing over time.
Just one very quick question, Steve.
Steve Johnson, University of Glasgow. It's a relatively fundamental question. The vision of CAFS was to make Scotland have the cleanest air in Europe. My question is, who currently has that accolade, and how far away from that is Scotland at the moment?
In terms of who heads the league table, that's not easy to say that in simple terms, because there's so many variables. I mean, in terms of general comparisons, we're doing pretty well. I think we're up there. We've probably got a bit of a way to go, but we're definitely up there, and we think it's something that we can achieve within the timescale of this strategy, and it's something that we're going to work towards.
Okay. Okay, that's the end of session 2 just now.